Welcome to episode 37. My name is Stuart McCullough. I'm the CEO of VHIA. And starting with this week's Industrial Roundup, we have just completed the September round of regional forums with our visit to Swan Hill. Thank you to all of those members who attended one of the 5 regional forums we've conducted over the past month. And just a reminder that we'll be doing those again in March and September of next year. If your health service would like to host one of the regional forums for 2018, it's not too early to volunteer. We've also already had a number of members who have volunteered to host, but we would look forward to more. And we do look forward to heading out to the regions again in 2018. With respect to community health, where bargaining across multiple agreements continues, including for medical scientists, allied health professionals, health and allied services, and the various dental agreements. Some progress is being made with regards to those. In particular, I would like to acknowledge the work of the Enterprise Agreement Working Group. The Enterprise Agreement Working Group has been formed from volunteers from within community health, really to fashion a response to the claims being put by the unions. At the moment, that working group is providing assistance to us in developing a response for consideration in the first instance by our community health members prior to being put to the unions. As always, we are looking for an opportunity to move those negotiations along, but each of them do have a schedule for agreements which is helping to progress those negotiations. In terms of our health service members, there was a meeting of the mental health reference group that was conducted this week, and bargaining for doctors has continued, albeit that bargaining for this week has been confined to the Thursday. But we will resume twice weekly meetings starting from next week. We are also in the process of working through a single interest authorisation application to the Federal Workplace Relations Minister. Just a reminder that all of our activities are summarised on the VHIA community app, particularly if you want to keep an eye on how bargaining is progressing. That is the best way to get updates as they occur. And I would just make the point that we have just passed the 400 mark in terms of active users for the VHIA community app. So congratulations to those members who have signed on to the app. If you have not yet activated your account, please do not hesitate to contact VHIA so that we can assist you and ensure that you get all the information that you're entitled to. That's it for this week's Industrial Roundup. Welcome to the weekly update, where we go in depth with a particular subject. And joining me for this week's discussion is the Manager of Workplace Relations Services and the official Orange Wrangler for the Richmond Football Club, Tim Nagle. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Stuart. Good to be here.
I'm sure that's true. Tim, would you be kind enough to reveal the object that is the clue for this week's subject discussion?
Sure.
And for the benefit of those people who are listening to this podcast rather than watching, could you describe this week's object?
It is a WorkChoices, a new workplace relations system information pack.
And on the basis of that object, what would you say that the subject for this week's discussion is?
History of industrial acts.
Tim, I suspect that's the closest you've ever come to getting the right answer, but it's still wrong. I'll explain the relevance of that particular object, but just for the benefit of those people who are watching, they might have noticed that it had some words that were scribbled on the object. Let's make TIAB great again. Those have been put on there by my father. And I'll just make it clear that he does not speak for VHIA, its employees or subsidiaries. Today we're discussing a very specific entitlement that is relevant in the context of pregnant employees and parental leave. Specifically, we're talking about no safe job leave.
So where does no safe job leave originate from?
So we've had parental leave for decades, but paid no safe job leave is actually a more recent development, and it's come to us really through a legislative framework.
From the Fair Work Act?
Not from the Fair Work Act. Its origins are actually from the WorkChoices era iteration of the Workplace Relations Act, and that's the reason for this week's clue.
So WorkChoices, so it wasn't part of the Workplace Relations Act?
No, the original Workplace Relations Act dealt with the issue of parental leave in a schedule, in Schedule 14, and that schedule didn't go to the issue of transfer to a safe job, and it didn't go to the issue of paid no safe job leave. It's something of an irony that WorkChoices, which is generally associated with all kinds of misery, was actually responsible for introducing that concept into our industrial relations framework.
Yeah, it doesn't sort of jump out as one of those provisions from WorkChoices, does it? So how did it come about?
So Section 268 of that now repealed WorkChoices legislation had a provision in it that talked about an entitlement to be transferred to a safe job, and in that same section it dealt with what happened if that wasn't possible in the context of paid leave.
So what are the circumstances?
So there were certain circumstances that had to be satisfied. First of all, under the WorkChoices legislation, you had to be entitled to ordinary parental leave. Specifically, you had to qualify for that in terms of service, and you needed to have provided the relevant, complied with the relevant notice provisions. Then it was the case that if you had a medical certificate that said that you were fit to perform work, but that it was inadvisable to continue in your current role because of either an illness or risks associated with the pregnancy or hazards connected with the position. If those tests were met and you had that advice, then what the WorkChoices legislation said is that if the employer thought it was reasonably practicable to do so, then the employer was obliged to transfer that person to a safe job for a defined period of time.
So it's a little bit odd in a way in that the combination's strange, isn't it? So it's sort of that combination of where it's reasonably practical, and that implies some sort of discretion or a level of discretion.
On the part of the employer.
That's right, and then the absolute requirement to must transfer them in those circumstances.
It's a bit incongruous.
Yes. So the Fair Work Act 2009 continued that entitlement?
It did. The Fair Work Act has that provision, and it's part of the National Employment Standards. But rather than deal with all those subjects together in a single clause like the WorkChoices legislation did, it's set out and stepped out really in a number of clauses.
Is that a bad idea?
Not necessarily. By stepping it out in separate clauses rather than having a single clause, it's clearer and easier to understand than bunching it all together in a big clause. But the only risk is that sometimes people look at those clauses in isolation and they really all work together. And it's important perhaps when you're considering paid no safe job leave is to remember it's part of a framework and not just to consider it by itself.
And what are the relevant provisions in the Act?
So the relevant provisions of the Fair Work Act, and as I said, part of the National Employment Standards, Section 81, which is the transfer to a safe job provision, Section 81A, which is paid no safe job leave, Section 82, the employee who is on paid no safe job leave may be required to provide a further medical certificate, and Section 82A, unpaid safe job leave.
So you just mentioned that they're part of the National Employment Standards. What's the significance of that?
Yeah, the significance of having it as part of the National Employment Standards is that it's an absolute minimum entitlement for everyone. We have these provisions in our enterprise agreements. And the reason that we have them in our enterprise agreements is so that the answers to these questions are available in the document that people most commonly refer to and aren't contained simply somewhere else. However, even if our agreements were silent, these provisions with regards to transfer to a safe job and paid no safe job leave would apply because they are part of that minimum entitlement.
So what do the National Employment Standards provide for?
So we'll work through each section in turn, and just to start with Section 81, and it's entitled Transfer to a Safe Job. It applies to a pregnant employee if she gives evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person that she is fit for work, but it's inadvisable for her to continue to work in her present position during a stated period. And that stated period is referred to as the risk period. And that it's inadvisable for them to continue in their role during the risk period because of either an illness or risks arising in a pregnancy or hazards connected with the position.
It sounds pretty similar to the WorkChoices provision.
It is pretty similar, but there are some subtle differences. The first difference you might notice is that the WorkChoices legislation required a medical certificate, whereas this requires evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person.
So it could be something else other than a medical certificate?
It may be.
Like a statutory declaration, for instance?
A statutory declaration is possible, but I think it's worth noting a couple of the other differences between the old legislation and the new legislation. So under the old Act, the provision of a medical certificate was absolute. It couldn't be questioned. Evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person is by its nature far less absolute. And given that we're talking about fitness for work, that we're talking about the capacity to perform work safely, if you were given a statutory declaration, depending on the circumstances, an employer may or may not be satisfied with a statutory declaration as evidence.
So that would form the basis to decline the request or seek additional information?
So given those two choices, the choice between saying no to a request or to seek more information, I'd strongly recommend that people seek more information. If the evidence you've been given is, in your view, not sufficient to satisfy you, to reasonably satisfy you, then seek more evidence. I think it is strongly inadvisable to simply say no, particularly when the subject matter is considered, that is, we are talking about a safe work environment ultimately.
Is there a circumstance where a medical certificate might not be adequate information to satisfy a reasonable person?
It's possible, but it's extremely unlikely. So generally speaking, a medical certificate is good evidence and it should satisfy a reasonable person. But when you talk about if you were to receive a medical certificate and the circumstances seem to be in complete contradiction to the certificate that you've received, that might be a circumstance. And just remembering that what we're talking about here is a medical certificate that says that someone is fit to work as such. And if you received a certificate that someone was fit to work, but by all appearances they appeared to be completely incapacitated, then you might question that certificate, but you would need to be very cautious about it. I think the way it's framed is that when you talk about a reasonable person test, that's an objective test as such, and it really takes into account the circumstances around the evidence almost as well.
So it's really, I mean, it is an interesting test really, isn't it? Because the evidence must satisfy a reasonable person that the pregnant employee is fit for work, but it is inadvisable for her to continue in her present role during the risk period, either because of illness or risks arising out of her pregnancy or hazards connected with that position.
So I think it's really worth emphasising that point, that it is about somebody who is fit for work. It's not an entitlement that arises from being unfit to work.
That's right.
They've got to be fit to work, but there is something either arising out of the pregnancy or arising out of the job itself that makes it inadvisable for the person to perform that role for a designated period, for the risk period. But they are still fit for work. One of the interesting things that we've noticed with regards to these provisions, because they don't get a lot of attention, is that sometimes medical practitioners aren't as familiar with how to certify these set of circumstances. So they're much more familiar with certifying someone as being unfit for work or alternatively fit for work, but actually engaging with the subject matter here of being fit for work, but that there is something arising out of the pregnancy or out of the job that makes it inadvisable for them to perform that particular role for a risk period is something that not every medical practitioner is familiar with. And again, if there is something unsatisfactory or incomplete about the medical evidence that you receive, then seek more information rather than simply decline the request.
So what happens next?
So you receive the advice, the evidence under Section 81, and what that provides then is that if there is an appropriate safe job available, the employer must transfer the employee to that appropriate safe job, and there must be no other changes to the employee's terms and conditions of employment.
Is that different to the old Act?
Not really, but you'll notice there is a little bit of a shift in the language, and it goes away from what WorkChoices provided, which stated where the employer thinks it's reasonably practicable to do so, and shifts it to a requirement to transfer if there is a safe job available. And I think the shift there is away from a test that may have a subjective or may have had a subjective element to it, that is the view of the employer and potentially the discretion of the employer, through to something that is an objective consideration of fact. If, as a matter of fact, there is a safe job available, an appropriate safe job available, then the employee must be transferred to that appropriate safe job.
So you mentioned an appropriate safe job. What is an appropriate safe job?
Yeah, so that's a term that's defined in a limited way under the Fair Work Act at Section 81, subsection 3. And so it defines the term appropriate safe job as being the same ordinary hours of work as the employee's present position, or a different number of ordinary hours agreed to by the employee. Neither of those considerations go to the issue of safety. And I think it's probably worth noting that the issue of safety is really underpinned by the medical advice or the other evidence on that question.
So it sounds like the assumption is that it's the same ordinary hours.
That is certainly the assumption, but the Act does make it clear that it's open to the employee to agree to a different number of hours, and it is easy to imagine a circumstance where an employee might either request a different number of hours or be happy to agree to a different number of hours.
So if the employee does agree to work less hours, do they still receive their full pay?
So the employee receives the full rate of pay, and that term should be noted. They receive the full rate of pay for the hours that are worked during the risk period. So what that means is if there is a reduction in the hours because the employee has agreed to that reduction, you pay the full rate of pay for those hours worked.
Okay.
You don't need to maintain the wage as though they had worked their full number of hours.
And so what happens if there's no appropriate safe job available?
That's where the paid no safe job leave comes into operation. So Section 81A provides that if the circumstances that were provided in Section 81, namely that is the employee has provided evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person that they are fit to perform work, but that it's inadvisable for them to perform their current role due to issues arising from the pregnancy or from the role itself, and there's no appropriate safe job available, and that person is entitled to unpaid parental leave and has complied with the notice provisions of the Act, then under those circumstances the person is entitled to paid no safe job leave for the risk period.
So the entitlement to the paid leave only arises in those circumstances?
That's correct. So it's worth noting that the requirement to give paid no safe job leave requires that you are entitled to the unpaid parental leave. But under Section 81, where we started when we were talking about the transfer to a safe job, that requirement to be also entitled to unpaid parental leave is not present. And the difference there is that if you are somebody with less than 12 months service, for example, you still have those entitlements to be transferred to a safe job. But the entitlement to paid no safe job leave requires that you would otherwise be entitled to unpaid parental leave.
So if you were transferred to paid no safe job leave, that could be quite costly, presumably.
That's right, but that's where it's important to think about those provisions as a whole rather than just that individual item. So yes, it could be a significant cost to put someone on paid no safe job leave, but that's not really the point of the provision. It's not really trying to create additional paid leave. What it's trying to do is ensure that people are provided with a safe environment. And by providing paid no safe job leave, what it does is I think it focuses people's attention on the fact that there is a significant onus and expectation that safe work will be provided when people have an issue that is arising out of pregnancy. So for when people are fit for work, but there is that issue arising from the pregnancy of the job, the employer should give extraordinarily close consideration to a safe job for that risk period. But if that can't be done, then yes, there is that period of paid no safe job leave. What it means it's the person is not penalised, the employee is not penalised for the fact that that safe work can't be given to them.
So would an employer have to create a role in those circumstances?
No, there's no obligation to create a role, but it doesn't stop an employer from considering whether there is, for example, some kind of project work that could be undertaken by that pregnant employee for the risk period.
And what would happen if the employee's circumstances change?
Well, Section 82 goes to the issue of providing additional medical information, but it does so in a limited way. What it does, it creates an entitlement to ask for a medical certificate during that 6-week period prior to the expected date of birth, and that medical certificate goes to the issue of whether the employee is fit for work.
So what if a medical certificate's not provided?
Yeah, what the Act says is that if that medical certificate is not provided within 7 days, the employer can require the employee to take the parental leave as soon as practicable.
And what happens if the certificate says that they are unfit?
Same thing.
Yeah.
If the certificate says that they're not fit for duty, then the employer can require the employee to proceed onto parental leave as soon as practicable.
And so that has implications for the period of no safe job?
Of the paid no safe job leave, yeah, it does. It brings that period to an end. So when somebody goes off onto parental leave, paid no safe job leave finishes. Just drawing that distinction again, paid no safe job leave is about somebody who is fit for work. And once a person proceeds onto parental leave, that's the end of that risk period.
And is there any such thing as unpaid no safe job leave?
Yeah, there is, and that's contained at Section 82A, which really sort of completes that bundle of provisions. And that's a circumstance where the pregnant employee provides the evidence that we talked about at Section 81, that is evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person that they are fit for work, but that it's inadvisable for them to perform their current role because of some issue arising either from the pregnancy, illness or risk, or from the role itself that makes that inadvisable. Where that occurs and the person is not entitled to unpaid parental leave, then those are the circumstances where unpaid no safe job leave can arise. But just to emphasise again, even for somebody with, say, less than 12 months service who's not entitled to unpaid parental leave or long parental leave, a person under those circumstances who meets those requirements under Section 81 is still entitled to be transferred to a safe job.
So just on that, when would a person not be eligible for parental leave?
So for me, I mentioned before just briefly somebody with less than 12 months service. I think that's the most obvious example. And just bearing in mind a point of caution, having regard for the sector and the fact that we have some degree of portability of service, and that someone may have more than 12 months service within the sector rather than just at your particular workplace. So just because somebody hasn't been with you for 12 months, you should just consider the length of service that they have with them when they've come to you.
It's an interesting topic. Just to sum everything up, what would your advice be to members?
So the first thing is just to put it in context and to remember that these provisions are not really designed with the aim of creating ample new paid leave opportunities. These provisions are designed for safety and to strongly encourage people to consider transferring people to a safe job. And that's really where the emphasis of those provisions is. The second thing that I would strongly recommend to members is in that space around evidence. And if you're not satisfied with the evidence, to seek more evidence to that point that you are satisfied. And if the parties get stuck, bear in mind that as an NES provision, as a provision that's under the agreements, you can utilise the Commission. And I think having regard for the significance of the issue, an early reference to the Commission if the parties do get stuck would be advisable. Bearing in mind that there is a shared and mutual interest here in terms of doing these things and getting these things right, both in terms of safety and welfare, but also the continuation of employment. And what's occurring here is somebody is seeking to continue their employment as long as they can, and it's really just about a framework to ensure that that occurs appropriately. So the Commission, I think, is also another useful tool under these circumstances.
I think it's one of those things where it's really useful for employees to get their heads around it, not only the provisions but also the purpose of the provisions.
Very much so, and to see it in that light. So that does bring us to the end of our discussion, but I am conscious of the fact that we have a vintage WorkChoices information pack sitting on the desk which has never been opened. So I think today we should take the opportunity to open the vintage pack and see what it is that we have. So we've got a notepad, never been used. that is going to be highly prized. That is a mouse pad that can be utilised by anyone in the office. I think I'll give that to you, Tim. I don't know if there's anything else that catches your eye. Perhaps this WorkChoices pen, which includes a website address and information phone number. Well, there you go.
Very interesting.
I think we'll divide those up amongst the staff, or alternatively make them available to any members who might want to place their bid through the VHIA community app. Thank you for joining me for this discussion, Tim.
Thanks, Stuart.